Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we're here for my LEC Spring Split 2024 Primer video. Very excited to get into this. We are done with the Winter Split. We covered the entire thing. Of course, if you want to check out all of the analysis that I gave for the Winter Split here, you can check out the playlist listed up in the iCard right now. But in this video, we are going to be going over my power rankings, my primer, my get ready video for the Spring Split here in the LEC. This is both going to be for people who watched almost everything or all of my content or anything like that in the Winter Split, and also for people who might be joining the LEC. I don't know how many people would be interested in catching up, but this will kind of give a quick overview of where the team was at, going into the year in terms of perception and whether or not they lived up to that in the Winter Split now moving into spring. But we've got a lot of fun stuff to cover in today's video, so if you are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. Love hearing you guys' thoughts and feedback. Of course, these opinion-oriented videos are always a little bit more controversial just because that's generally how it goes. When I'm doing the weekly reviews, I don't get as much pushback on the opinions because it's just like, yeah, this team did well and this team didn't do well. But in these videos, I give a lot more structured and rigid opinions in terms of the power rankings and the player rankings. And so if you do find yourself enjoying it really at any point, whether that's now or in 20 minutes or in 40 minutes or whatever, it would really mean a lot to me if you hit that like button. I usually don't ask for it at the beginning of these videos, but for these opinion-based videos, it really does mean a lot. But with all that being said, it's time to jump into the actual video. If you are new here and haven't seen one of my primer videos before, what we are going to do in today's video is go from number 10 to number 1 in my personal power rankings, talking about each team, talking about all 5 players. I will have, of course, all of the teams ranked from number 10 to 1, and I will also have all of the players ranked from number 10 to number 1 inside their positions. It will also show whether they have increased or decreased in their positions from the beginning of winter when I did this primer for the Winter Split. Now, again, caveat that I always have to get out of the way very early on in these videos, player rankings are very finicky. There are some positions that it's just more important to be high on in the list than others, right? There are a lot of good top laners in the LEC. There are a lot of good mid laners in the LEC. Every AD carry is basically the same player in the LEC. That means that sometimes two players that have the same number next to them might be drastically different in terms of skill level. The number 6 jungler is probably a little bit better than the number 6 support in the LEC. That's just kind of how it has been recently, and so that's certainly something to keep in mind. Don't just see two numbers that are identical next to each other and say that I think they're equal players. I will be going in depth on my opinion and analysis on all of the players and how they work together as a team as we go throughout this video. I would definitely pay more attention to my words than to the graphic on the screen. It's helpful, but it's not the entire story. So with all that being said, it is time to jump into the analysis, and of course that means we get to start off with number 10 in my personal power rankings, and coming in at number 10, it is unfortunately still going to be Karmine Corp for me. I think a lot of people are going to move this team up in their power rankings because they finished so strong, at least in accordance to the rest of their split. They were 2-0 in their last 2, but those were the only 2 wins that they had all split long, and so that was certainly something, it was good to see it, but it didn't completely change my thoughts and opinions about this team. One of those wins was really big over BDS, but I think you can really write in, especially now that BDS wasn't exactly at their full form. We know there was problems going on in the locker room, but even so, they had already locked in a top 2 seed. That game did not matter to them. I could reasonably believe that BDS just took it off and that K-Corp was able to pick up a win that way, but I just need to see a lot more from this team, because even though there are good pieces, the overall package that they put out in the Winter Split was just simply put not good enough. They were not good enough basically across the board, and so let's go ahead and kind of dissect why I feel that way. Of course, their lineup is Cabochard in the top lane, Bo in the jungle, Seiken in the mid lane, Upset at AD carry, and Targamas at support. A couple of these players coming in as dead last in their positions, Cabo, Seiken, and Targamas all being not very good in the Winter Split, and there's really no other way to say it. As you can see, Cabochard moved down 1 to get to 10, Seiken moved down 2 to get to 10, Targamas moved down 3 to get to 10. I had expectations for these players, and it wasn't just me, it was a lot of other people as well that expected this title-winning team, this EU Masters winning team, to be able to actually make an impact early on with some decent additions, but it just didn't end up working out. Cabochard was entirely outclassed for a majority of the Winter Split. Again, he was really good in those final 2 games, and that's something that I'm going to keep in mind, but, again, for 90% of the Winter Split, Cabochard Cabo was so clearly the worst top laner in the LEC that it wasn't even really debatable. His laning phases were awful. He was transitioning early leads that he was able to get very rarely into basically nothing in the mid to late game where he just wasn't team fighting particularly well. He was not a good player. He has to be better. He's known for being this really solid, stable, weak side top laner. He was not that. He was losing in lane. He was not good on weak side, falling to ganks, not being relevant with low resources. It just wasn't a very good look for him. He simply has to be better than that. Seiken is also somebody who simply just has to get more confident. The problem with Seiken, as opposed to someone like Cabo who kind of just felt like he was outclassed, Seiken had moments where he was able to like mechanically keep up with a lot of the other mid laners he was playing against, but his confidence is just not there. I've never seen a mid laner at this level play so scared and so passive, and it hurt him so much over the course of the winter split. If he continues to just give over resource after resource to basically just seed the lane, try to go neutral, never even really try to win, even winning matchups, he's not going to be a good mid laner. He was a relatively okay team fighter, especially as he started to develop a bit more confidence at this level, but his laning was so passive and so non-effective that it didn't really give any pressure to the rest of the team. Bo really struggled in the early game because he never really had pressure in the mid lane. It's something that simply has to be better for Seiken. And then Targamas, again, outside of the last 2 games, he might have been the single worst player in the LEC. Game losing plays after game losing plays. It was bad mechanically. It was bad macro wise. It just didn't work out for Targamas. And to me, this is like the final opportunity that he has here in the LEC. He was given obviously that big opportunity on G2. Wasn't his first rodeo. I think he played for Giants back in the day, but he was given that second rodeo with G2. Looked really good. Excel just bombed out last year. A lot of problems. Had to go back to K Corp. Won EU Masters with them. Got another shot here in the LEC, and it was awful. It just didn't work out. Again, if he's the player that he was for a majority of the winter split, it almost doesn't matter whether or not the rest of this team ends up stepping up because he was the worst player in the LEC for a lot of that. Seiken and Cabo were definitely pushing him though. Those 3 players are the question marks for this team because the other 2 players on this team are fine. Upset looks like he has a super low ranking and that he fell super far in my rankings, going from number 2 to number 8, which is a pretty, substantial fall. It's certainly one that is noticeable. However, I want to make the point very clear in this ranking. I said it in the intro, but I want to say it again here. I actually have an identical grade on every single AD carry from number 1 to number 9. And I just kind of sorted them based on my personal preference and confidence and things like that in those players, maybe the form that they're in, the quality of chances that they're going to get. But truly, like AD carry 1 to AD carry 9 in my player rankings, they're all like B to B+. Like on any given day, they're going to be very good, but consistently, we just haven't seen it from a game-to-game basis. That's just what we have in the LEC right now. We don't really have an ADC that has like planted their flag and said like, I am the guy, I am the best, I'm winning here in the LEC for longer than a split. I think Upset obviously was poor last split, but a lot of that you can attribute to the fact that he was not getting any resources. I've never seen a team fail to peel for their AD carry nearly as much as K Corp was able to do last split. A lot of that is on Upset as well, though. His positioning was very lackadaisical. It felt like he was forcing a lot of plays. If this team does continue to struggle, I imagine Upset will also continue to struggle. But I think if they can turn things around, specifically if Targamas can get a little bit better, start to get back to that lane dominance he is kind of known for coming up from the ERLs, then Upset I think could have a better split. I don't want to count him out as an individual player. I just would expect him to perform a bit worse than maybe his contemporaries because of the team he is on. And then the one bright spot last split was a Bo in the jungle. He was absolutely the one player that you're looking at and saying like, oh, okay, you're like really showing things. I'm still a lot lower on Bo, I think, than the consensus. He still does have 1 or 2 plays every single game where it's like, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? What's the point? But the mechanical ceiling was always there. He was somebody who would dominate games on Vitality, but the problem last year, and the reason he actively was losing that team games, was because he would either win or lose you the game. He would make plays that would flip the game on its head instantly, and oftentimes they would not go right because the rest of the team wasn't there to back him up. Those kinds of things have been limited. He's better at playing within structure so far in 2024. That's going to need to continue if he goes back to his ways of being a little bit more flip-floppy. Then I do think it's going to be a bit of a problem, but from what we saw, he was better than what I expected on this K Corp team in winter, even with everything else going wrong around him. So I hope that that's able to continue, but as you can see, it's just really hard to have a lot of confidence in this team. Hopefully they can carry that form in from the last 2 games, but that's really relying on Cabo, Seiken, and Targamas all stepping up and all being better than bottom of their roles. Even if Upset and Bo are good, which I think they are good players, it's just not enough to be able to cancel out what those 3 were doing for most of the split. They have to get better or K Corp is once again going to be in the bottom 2. And then moving on to number 9 in my power rankings, the other team that I project to be in the bottom 2. And once again, there is no change from the standings in the winter split. It's going to be Rogue coming in at number 9 for me. I know how creative. It's the bottom 2 teams from winter as the bottom 2 teams in spring. Will it be like this? Almost certainly not. There's just too many surprises in the LEC. Almost said the LCK. Too many surprises in the LEC, and it's just impossible to predict this region. I think that has become apparent to anybody that has tried. There is just never going to be the level of continuity that there is in other regions, the level of predictability that there is in other regions. Some players are always going to over or underperform their norms, but for Rogue, it's just hard to predict that it's going to be them. They're one of the few teams that did actually go out and make a change going into the spring split, one of 2. Their top is different now. Shigenda is out, and Finn is actually back in here for Rogue. It's been a while since he's been in this organization, but he is back in the top lane. I don't really think this changes much for Rogue. I really would have the same grade on their top lane with or without Finn in there, but their lineup in total is looking like Finn in the top lane, Marcoon in the jungle, Larson in the mid lane, Comp at AD carry, and Zoelise at support. It's an okay team, like, on paper. I think when you look at this roster, and the reason that I had them at number 6 in my preseason power rankings was because, you know, you look at Marcoon and Larson, and I really like those two. Wasn't super big on Comp, but Zoelise was a super interesting prospect. I thought Shigenda was a little bit interesting last year, especially in the team fight stage of the game. You know, there were positives to take away from each individual player, and the LEC generally got worse, and so it felt like Rogue might be able to put together kind of a budget roster that worked well here. But the problem is what they did was get a bunch of contrasting styles and players that make each other worse by being on the team with each other, specifically Marcoon and Larson. I really like these players individually, but I have to rank them for what they're going to offer this year, and what they're going to offer is very slow, very passive gameplay. Marcoon is much more of a team fighter, not really somebody who likes to push the tempo in the early game out of the jungle position. That's fine, but Larson is also more of a team fighter and not someone who really wants to push the tempo out of the mid lane position. And when you put these two together, oftentimes you're just getting nothing done in the early game, and that's exactly what we saw from Rogue. That was my concern. I think I said verbatim in my winter primer was that the only concern here is that synergistically, maybe Marcoon can't actually carry the early game in the same way that someone like Malrang could for Larson, and it could become a problem. That's exactly what happened. But it's not just these two that concern me when it comes to this roster, even though I do think both of them are making each other worse by playing off of each other. I think Comp and Zoelise are the worst bot lane in the LEC. Obviously, you know, you could argue that Zoelise had some interesting games last split, but he got worse as the split progressed, as things started to crumble around him, as the situation got worse. I think he also individually started playing a lot worse. He was making plays that were bad. His mechanics really fell off. The laning phase for this team fell off, and at this point, like I said, numbers 1 to 9 in terms of the AD carry position all have like a B grade for me. My clear number 10 is Comp. I really think that at this point, there's just nothing else to say. He had that one miracle year in 2022, and ever since then, it's just not been good. Before then, in my opinion, it wasn't very good. I thought the Vitality days were really underwhelming. He got picked up by Rogue. I did not like the addition at the time. He blew everybody out of the water, got to the quarterfinals of Worlds, and then in 2023, he reverted back to what he was on Vitality, and he's been that ever since. He's just not been a very good AD carry, and at this point, with so many AD carries that at least have good traits and are realistically good every so often, Comp has to be considered the worst in the region at the moment. I really don't even think that's debatable for me. He is the only one without a B grade. Whether you want to give him B- or C+ or whatever, I think he is clearly number 10, at least for me going into this split. Finn is really the X factor here, because if he can come in and be like a strong side top laner, I do think that changes the equation at least a little bit. It gives Marcoon something to do in the early game, because Larson's never really going to be the one to take a lot of those resources, and we've seen what Finn can do when he is given resources, when he's allowed to play super aggressive, specifically on things like Gangplank. I just don't know if Finn is consistent enough as a player to be able to pull that off. The big knock on Finn, ever since he came back to the LEC, and obviously this was the case on CLG as well, was that he just can't stay good for more than 2 or 3 games in a row. He'll have 1 or 2 games where he just completely destroys, where he dominates the game. This is what he was on Astralis, where he would dominate and really look good, and then, you know, the next week he would look really bad, and it was a perpetual cycle for him where he could never sustain really any sort of dominance. It was really 1 week of very good, and then the rest wasn't great either. Like, that's what he was on Excel 2 years ago as well, and so I'm not really expecting Finn to be able to come in and fix this team's problems, but again, perhaps he can be that aggressive force that this team can play for. I just don't love that being in the top lane. Generally, I think this team is going to underperform their talent level all year, and if K-Corp overperforms in any miraculous way, then I would bet Rogue is a very clear, easy choice to be that number 10 team. The only reason they're not getting it is I think the trio of Cabochard, Seiken, and Targamas are just a little bit worse than, the worst individual players on Rogue, and obviously Rogue beat K-Corp in the final week of the season in Winter, and so you can't exactly say that they are worthless in that regard, but this team has a lot to go to get to even like a remotely playable place in terms of play style. Right now, they are just one of the worst teams in the LEC. And then moving on to number 8 in my power rankings, the top 8 are the same top 8 that made playoffs last split, but as I talked about for a lot of that split, there was a very clear number 8 in that dynamic, and that for me is GIANTX. I think it is a bottom 3 more than it is a top 8. I will make that abundantly clear. If this team finishes in the bottom 2, I'm really not going to be all that surprised. They're not really exceptional in any area. The reason that they ended up being better than a lot of the bottom teams, than K-Corp, than Rogue over the course of last split, was simply because they don't have bottom out players in the same way that those other two teams do. You don't have somebody on this team that is going to be like the worst player in the entire league. I mean, we all kind of thought that that's what Jackie's would be, but he had some games that were atrocious and some games that were good. For the most part, he showed interesting development for somebody who was so young and so new to the league. I want to give some positivity to him, but everybody else in this team, you can describe by the words, like they're mid. They are just fine, and that's why they come in at number 8 for me. Their lineup is obviously Ottawamne in the top lane, Peach in the jungle, Jackie's in the mid lane, Patrick at AD carry, and Ignar at support. This is a really interesting collection of players. I was obviously super low on them going into the year. I had them at number 9 in my initial power rankings. A lot of people had them higher. I saw this team actually talked about relatively positively in the offseason. People thought Ignar was a good addition. People thought that Ottawamne and Peach were going to be a really good duo again, and I was definitely more hesitant about the upside of what this team was, specifically because I didn't really like their mid pickup of Jackie's. He's such a young player. He'd never really played at any sort of high competitive level before, and now he has to play against LEC mids every single day. It's not an easy task, but he kind of lived up to the billing. Like, obviously the inconsistency was there. He's a young kid and really hadn't had a lot of experience playing at a high level, but he had good games and they were against good mid laners, and so you can see what GX was seeing in him. I just think that it won't kind of blossom in year number 1. That definitely is going to be kind of something that is in the long term. Maybe by the end of the year, you're starting to see bigger signs, but I wouldn't expect that to continue to be a positive. He's going to be one of the weaker mids if he's not the weakest mid, right? Like, Seiken was worse for sure in the winter split, but Jackie's might be worse. He has a lower toolkit, I would say, than someone like Seiken does, if Seiken can get that confidence back. But a lot of the positives for this team were the top side of the map. Ottawamne and Peach returning from Excel. Obviously, from last year, this team almost made Worlds, and these two as a duo were very important to that. But Ottawamne was like sneakily very, very bad in the winter split. I don't really know what happened to him. This feels like a better situation than he was on in any time before summer of last year, and he was actually still playing well even when that team was in disaster mode in winter and spring of 2023. And so for this to be the season where his individual performances just really fall off, it's definitely disappointing, but, hopefully he can get, the rebound. That was a really, really rough winter split, one of the worst top laners in the league, and you have to imagine he's going to be better, which is why I'm only dropping him to number 7, but I mean, how much better is he going to be, right? He has to be the primary carry. He was a big reason people had confidence in this team to begin with, me included, was because he was one of the best top laners in the league for many, many years. Did not happen. That was not the case in the winter split. That has to be better. And Peach is exactly who I said he was. Super stable, engaged player, somebody who likes, Maokai, likes Sejuani, likes to play these more tanky, engaged styles, can play something more aggressive, but it isn't really his style, and is going to fit more into the team, is a good facilitator, but isn't exceptional. That's just who Peach is. He's going to win against bad junglers and lose against good junglers. He is the definition of mid on this team. He's fine. He's not going to be a problem for you, but I doubt he ever breaks through. And last split, I think, was exactly what he has been his entirety of the time in the LEC. Very interestingly, worth noting, GX actually picked up Juhan from DRX over in the LCK to be their ERL jungler. Don't know if that's just kind of prepping him for a spot, but Juhan would be significantly more interesting to me here. Obviously, world champion, but not as a starter, as a sub on that DRX team. I think he would be a very interesting piece here. He actually fits into the playstyle of this team very well. Certainly something to keep an eye on, but for now, Peach is fine. And then you've got Patrick and Ignar. I mean, the definition of, okay, like you give them good opportunities and they're going to be able to capitalize on it. Ignar is the exact type of player. He plays to the skill level of the teammates around him and not, he doesn't raise his team up. I still think he's a good player and he is the best player on this team in his current state. In my opinion, Ottawamne should be, but Ignar is the best player on this team at the current moment. Hopefully he can keep that up. I mean, I don't really expect him to, especially because Patrick is so slow. And, we talk about players like Patrick and Teddy all the time, like that archetype of player where it's like you're so talented, you have the mechanics, and you often do win lane. You're just not aggressive enough in terms of your mentality to carry games and be one of the best players on the team. If Patrick was the secondary carry here on GX, I would care more. Like, I would think that that's a huge positive. He's one of the better secondary carries in the LEC, but because he's going to be asked to, obtain a lot of the resources for them with a really young mid and a top laner that just isn't clicking right now, I don't know if I love that situation for GX. When you're relying on Patrick to win you games, that's just going to get you to about a 500 record. That's kind of what we've seen over his tenure, and that's what GX is. They're a 500 to below 500 team, and there are just teams with much more excitement ahead of them. Basically, all of the top 7 have shown something to show that they might even be a top 4 team. GX is just not in that mold. They are not a team that I would expect to be on that level. It is a bottom 3, but to their credit, I think they come in at the top of that bottom 3. And then moving on to number 7 in my power rankings, this is where we start to get to teams that I genuinely think are good. The bottom 3 are very clear to me, but when you get to the top 7, I think you can honestly put a lot of these middle teams in almost any order. But for me personally, coming in at number 7, it is going to be SK Gaming. A lot of people are going to want to see this team a little bit higher. They finished in 5th in the playoffs, 3rd in the regular season. This team was actually very interesting to watch. They obviously got out to a ridiculously hot start, 3-0, the only team to go undefeated in week number 1, but they just couldn't maintain it. And a lot of that was natural regression back to the mean. I think a lot of these players are interesting, but a lot of them did not keep up the momentum and the pressure that they were able to get at the beginning part of the season throughout the rest of the playoffs in particular. And so we'll go ahead and talk about that when we get there, but their lineup is looking like Irrelevant in the top lane, Isma in the jungle, Niski in the mid lane, Exakick at AD carry, and Doss at support. I like this collection of players, and I think this team is good enough to be top 4, to potentially make a world championship. I think that that is a realistic goal for this team to have. Do I think they are there yet? Probably not. I think there are some things that just have to get better and more consistent. Let's talk about the good first and foremost. Obviously, the first thing that people are going to point to in terms of what happened in the winter split was Irrelevant in the top lane, who really kind of broke out in terms of the public perception as a carry-oriented top laner, somebody who could demolish lane and really put himself in good positions, and I absolutely agree. I think I'm really happy to see a player who I was very high on in the misfit stage of his career kind of turned into a really consistent and strong top laner. He's only going to go to number 4 for me. I saw so many people saying he is clear-cut, easily the number 1 top laner in the LEC. I don't see that, and I push back a lot on that in my weekly reviews. I think that the thing with Irrelevant is he wins winning matchups harder than almost anybody else, maybe harder than anybody else, except maybe Adam, in the entire league, and he loses losing matchups. Like, that is just the player that he is. If you give him last pick, if you give him, red side counter pick, he's going to be in a pretty good spot, and honestly, he's going to be able to take advantage and win most matchups, even against players that I have listed above him in the top lane rankings, but when he's not in those advantageous matchups through draft, he does perform significantly worse, as we saw for a lot of the winter split. And so I expect that to continue. He's going to be situationally one of the best top laners in the entire league. For what it's worth, he has the same grade as numbers 2 and 3 in my system. The other player that honestly was so good for me in the winter split that I have to shout him out is Doss in the support position. He went very under the radar in terms of just how important he was towards SK Gaming, but he was very quietly like a top 3 support in the LEC last split. Really fun stuff from him, and I'm really hoping he can keep up that level of development. When we were looking at this duo, it was Exakick that was the star, it was him that was brought in, and Doss was kind of the package, right? You wanted to make Exakick happy, you wanted to give him somebody that he wanted to play with, and so Doss ends up getting an LEC spot. They played well last year, and so they get back here, but Exakick has never really taken that next step beyond what he showed last year, and really hasn't become that consistent carry for this team that they wanted him to be. It's been Doss that's really broken out as this big playmaker in the support position. He is a above average support for sure, and somebody that this team is very happy to have. If they get better, I think a lot of that is going to be this bot lane starting to win, and Exakick is certainly not somebody I'm writing off. Like I said, 1 to 9 in my 80 carries all are B graded players. The problem with Exakick is just that when he's given resources, he doesn't do nearly as much of, with those as the other players that are around him. I have players like Upset and Patrick right above him. I just don't really feel comfortable enough to say Exakick is definitely better than those players at the current moment. I have to make it clear. I think Exakick should be above them. I had him, I want to say at like number 3 or number 2 or somewhere around there at the end of winter last year. This was somebody who felt like he was on the cusp of becoming the next superstar AD carry in the LEC, but things have just kind of gone downhill since then. I think DOS obviously getting better is going to help this lane, but he needs to be better with resources. He needs to be better as the primary carry of this team. He just couldn't fulfill that role in winter. Niski I thought was very underratedly good last split. He's going to get a lot of hate. He's going to get a lot of flame, but he's going to do the thing that he does at a super high level, and in 90% of the games, he's going to be ridiculously valuable. Still one of the best mid laners in the entire region. He comes in at number 4. Not a ton to talk about with Niski. I feel the same about him now as I did going into the year. And then Isma. Isma was one of the big, positive surprises, I would say, at the beginning of the split. Was player of the week in week number 1. Really stood out in SK's 3-0 week. Was dominating games. That level 3 gank that he had in the first week was so consistent, and teams were just not ready for it that they were able to carry that strong early game that he was able to generate into a lot of advantages. The problem was that he got progressively worse game after game after game. I don't know if people started to find him out, but he started playing more passive. Those level 3 ganks completely disappeared by the end of the split, and he kind of just became this tank engage jungler, which is not what got him that big, breakout week in week number 1 in the first place. And so you just got to hope that he can sense that maybe that aggressive style is what was working at the beginning of the split, and maybe going back to that is going to give him more results. As it is, what we saw at the end of the regular season and in the playoffs was a mediocre mid-level jungler. So that's what I'm going to rank him as. If he can get that fire back, that early game aggression, almost similar to someone like Malrang, not the same player, but like similar style. If you can get that back for Isma, I like this team significantly more, and I think they are going to shoot up. Isma is really the key that I think will unlock the rest of this team. Exakick is also that, but DOS, Niski, and Irrelevant, I feel very good about them. It's really about the young players on SK and whether or not they are going to develop. Again, if this team makes top 4, I'm not going to be surprised at all. It's just for me, right now, they're going to come in at the bottom of this kind of middle tier of teams at 7. And now moving on to number 6 in the power rankings. The top 6 is always a pretty important benchmark to hit, in my opinion, and coming in just in at that number 6 spot for me, it is going to be Team Vitality. And I think some people might see this as too low. Maybe it's too high again. I think SK and Vitality are basically identical teams. I very much had a couple of teams where I was like, you could flip-flop either of them. I think the team above this team at 5 could either be 5 or 7. I don't think they should be 6. I don't think you should separate Vitality and SK, but I do think you can put Vitality and SK in whatever order you want. And so for Vitality to come in at number 6, I think this is a relatively fair place to put them. They're an interesting team, and I do think that they have a lot going for them. They had a couple of players that really stepped up in the winter split, but a couple of players that I just don't really believe in. One player that I don't believe in, and another player that has a lot to prove after a really bad winter split. So let's talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Photon in the top lane, Douglas in the jungle, VTO in the mid lane, Karzi at AD carry, and Hylissang at support. Let's get the elephant out of the room. I'm probably going to get flamed for putting Karzi as the number 4 AD carry because it seems like it's just become a consensus opinion that he's like number 1 or number 2 in the league. I don't really get where that opinion is. I think recency bias definitely plays a lot into that. He is somebody who does ramp up as the split goes on, and he'll have better games once he feels a lot more comfortable on a team. People forget that for the first third of the season, the first week of the season, he was unplayable. Like that week 1 was so bad from Karzi. Like he had games where it was like, you got to take him off. Like they were 0-3, and it was not just because I don't think jungle's very good and because Hylissang wasn't playing well. Karzi was also miserable during that time, and so I'm trying to factor that in along with the fact that, he's had a lot of good games, and so he comes in somewhere in the middle for me at number 4. Still better than a lot of these other AD carries that don't have the big pop-off moments that Karzi has, but I'm not nearly as high on him as a player as I think other analysts and other people who watch the LEC are. I just think he's fine, which is why he's just in this cluster of players, I should say, in the AD carry role that are around a B, inconsistently good, and that's, I think, the best way to describe Karzi. I think Hylissang simply has to be better than what he was in winter, though. I spent almost all of winter defending Hylissang, and I stand by everything that I said. I went on long tangents and rants, and you guys seem to appreciate those in the comments about how it's ridiculous that people are freaking out about Hilly, saying obviously his time is done. He's never going to be good again. It's time to wrap it up. It's time to retire for Hylissang. It's a waste of time if he doesn't retire after the winter split, etc., etc. All the stuff that Reddit says. When this is who Hylissang is. This has always been who Hylissang is. This isn't even the worst split that he's ever had. Do people forget about 2022 summer? He was horrible in 2022 summer. His last split on Fnatic was horrible, like actually genuinely horrid, and I think that was worse than this split. But, like, you take the good with the bad. That's Hylissang. Like, that's just what you get. You're going to have the bad splits, and then you're also going to have his 2023, where I thought he was very underratedly good. A lot of people gave a lot of the credit for those games to Carzzy. I thought Hylissang did a lot more than he got credit for on Mad Lions in this bot lane, and, you know, you would have to just hope that the coin's going to flip around. He's going to keep taking those risks, and in winter it didn't pay off. Maybe in spring it does. That's just who Hilly is going to be. Of course, he was bad in winter, so he drops. Also, I think supports were generally better than I was expecting in winter, which means that, you know, inevitably players end up rising. We already talked about a player like Doss that ended up rising a lot. He only rose up one spot, and I thought he was so good. Like, I think supports were just generally very good in the winter split, and Hylissang ends up falling because of that. But I think Carzzy and Hilly will be fine. They're going to be a very volatile bot lane. They're going to have good games, and they're going to have bad games. That's just who these two are. That's what they were on Mad. That's what they are now. I mean, you're not going to expect them to be good every single game. That's just what it is. Then you've got the two solo laners. This is the big positive of the team for me. Photon is still really good. I mean, he just wins. Like, that's just what this guy does. I compare him to Someday. I think they're very similar players for those of you who watch the LCS or like old LCK for a long time, like KT Arrows LCK for a long time ago. But it's that style of just like, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to win lane, I'm going to generate this gigantic lead, and I'm still useful in team fights. Like, it's very consistent. He's very mechanically talented, and, you know, it would take a lot for him to just not be one of the better top laners in the league. He's so consistent in terms of how he's able to punish mistakes that other top laners make. Maybe he's not the flashiest player. Maybe he doesn't take over in team fights as much as like someone like Irrelevant that is listed below him, but Photon is so consistent from a game-to-game basis, basically no matter what his matchup is, that I'm really not all that worried. His mechanics are going to carry him into being one of the better top laners at absolute minimum. This guy is really, really good. And then VTO in the mid lane, who was the star for Vitality in the winter split. Finally, we have been waiting for VTO to come back, for Misfits VTO to come back. Things were a disaster on Excel last year. He ends up getting moved to Heretics in the middle of the year. He was definitely better on Heretics, but he still was showing a lot of the negative traits that he showed on Excel. You know, having to resort to a smaller champion pool, not being nearly as good when he was flexed out onto things he wasn't as comfortable on. That all changed in the winter split. It really did feel like Misfits VTO was back. Obviously, still going to be a bit better on these assassin picks, and that's always going to be something that is kind of his specialty, his pocket pick, the Akali, you know, things like that. That's always going to be better for him, but he's gotten back to being really good at mages like he was at the beginning of his career, and he was very quietly one of like the 5 best players in the LEC in the winter split. Obviously, Vitality wasn't dominating, but almost every single game was off the back of VTO getting advantages mid and being able to win team fights for his team in the late game. He is the reason this team is ranking high, and honestly, you could put them higher. You could put them in number 5. I think that's very realistic to have them at this point. I think a lot of that comes down to VTO, but if you're higher on the bot lane, that's probably where I think they are. The reason I'm a bit lower, though, is again, I just don't trust jungle. Douglas is not a player that I think is particularly interesting. He's good on champions that are a little bit more, I don't want to say simple to play, but like, it was the brand that was such a big pick for Vitality over the back half of the season going into the playoffs. When they picked brand, they were able to win. When they didn't pick brand, they lost. And, you know, that's kind of the mentality of Douglas is just not consistent enough on the meta junglers to really be able to win. And that's why he's still going to come in at number 10. I had major concerns about his playstyle coming into the year, although he was better than I was anticipating on Vitality B. But he was exactly what I thought he was going to be, and I thought he was going to be the number 10 jungler. Like, he's not an awful player, he's not unplayable, and you can win with someone like Douglas. I just don't think you can ever be a top team with Douglas in the jungle. He just hasn't proven that yet. Maybe he breaks out here in spring, but, you know, he hasn't exactly ignited a lot of confidence for me, and that's what Vitality is. It's a team that I think will be led by VTO in team fights. You know, Carzzy and Hilly are going to have good games and bad games. They're going to win the good games, they're going to lose the bad games, and, you know, players like Photon are going to be consistent on the top side. Douglas will be consistent in his own, you know, kind of unique way, and Vitality's just going to be okay because of it. Maybe they break into that top 4. Again, VTO and Carzzy plus Photon obviously have the potential to be a breakthrough kind of trio for this team. I just don't know if I expect that to happen for Vitality this split. I think they're just going to be fine, very similar to what they were in the winter. And now moving on to the top 5 teams in my power rankings. Number 5, and I know this one is going to be a bit more controversial because this is better than what they finished in the winter split, but I do think this team should be better than what they were. It's Team Heretics coming in at number 5. They were obviously not a top 5 team by the end of the split. For a lot of the split, it looked like they were a top 2, top 3 team, but they collapsed down the stretch. You know, stop me if you've heard this before from a Perks team. They collapsed down the stretch, really weren't able to maintain their momentum, and honestly were really bad in the playoffs. Not a very competitive competitive team. One of the easier ones, you know, alongside GX to see eliminated in the early parts of the playoffs, and that's not a good look for them, but they did go and make a change. It's certainly an intriguing one. First of all, if you don't follow me on Twitter, go follow me on Twitter. I already talked about this change a bunch on that, you know, on Twitter, on X. You can go and follow me there if you want, like, live, I guess, reactions to some of these changes, but obviously, new support coming in with Trimby coming into the support position. He's one of the best supports in the entire region, but you're replacing one of the best supports in the entire region who just had a career rejuvenation type of year, or type of split, I would say, in winter. So very strange, but let's go ahead and talk about the team as a whole. It's Wunder in the top lane, Yankos in the jungle, Perks in the mid lane, Flacket at AD carry, and Trimby at support. The reason that I think you go to someone like Trimby and the change in mentality that I think this team is going to have moving into spring, and why I think you would bring this in, is because, to me, this signals that you want to play a lot more towards Flacket, towards bot lane, towards early aggression in 2v2s, playing things like Kalista, playing things, you know, that can take over in the early laning phase. That's kind of the idea behind bringing a player like Trimby in, who I think is a great laner. Like, that's what Trimby is being brought in for. Obviously, his shot calling is very good, but what Trimby has made his name for in the LEC is being one of the most dynamic 2v2 support players in the entire region, or in the region's history, honestly. He dominates, you know, individual laning phases before 8 minutes, unlike any other support, and maybe he's not as effective on the engagers and team fights, and maybe he's not the perfect skirmisher. He doesn't really roam all that much in comparison to other supports, but if you're bringing him in, if you're specifically choosing to replace someone like Kaiser with him, who is that roaming support, somebody who wants to play the engagers, wants to get out on the map and try to create a lot of macro problems, you want to replace Kaiser with Trimby. That signals to me that the 2v2 for Heretics is going to become infinitely more important. I don't understand why you would make this move if that was not the intention. And so Trimby's really good in that role, and he's going to rank really highly in terms of supports. I thought it was a big mistake for Fnatic to not re-sign him over June, and that, I'm not going to say it turned out to be right, but that bot lane underperformed for most of the year, and I think Trimby's going to come in here, and I think he's going to make Flacket look really good as an AD carry. That's just kind of what he has done everywhere he has been, whether it's with Hansama, whether it's with Comp, whether it's with Noah. Everybody that he's played with has looked better because they're playing with him, and I imagine Flacket will follow suit. But Flacket himself is a very talented player. He's somebody who is pretty solid as an AD carry. He's never really had that opportunity to break out because he's never really been given the resources, but if there ever was a time, if there ever was a split for him to break out, it's almost certainly going to be this one, because now he's got Trimby in the support position. He's got a player who is known for making AD carries look a lot better. I think Flacket can step up to the plate and be this team's primary carry, and in fact, I would expect that to be their primary way of playing throughout most of spring, but, you know, he's got to be able to prove it. He's never been the primary carry on an LEC team his entire tenure. He's had options, you know, like you look at summer of last year when he finally got put in for Heretics, and he was dominating in the beginning of that split, but they started to move away from him and more towards VTO in the mid lane in terms of the pressure and the resources that they were putting in. Obviously, you're hoping that he can live up to it, but he's got to prove it. I think he will. I think he'll be fine, and that's a reason why Heretics ranks highly, but, you know, it's worth noting that he hasn't done it before at this level. You still have Wunder and Yankos on this team. Yankos was, like, underratedly bad last split. He really didn't get a lot of talk. A lot of the flame went to Perks, and rightfully so. Perks was really bad, and we will get to him, but Yankos was also kind of bad. His early games were just not nearly as good. His tempos seemed to have fallen off quite a bit. It's funny because he has better teammates around him this year than he did at any point last year, and he's playing significantly worse than he did last year. He was amazing last year with, you know, significantly less talent. It's going to be interesting to see if that continues. I would expect Yankos to bounce back and be fine, but, you know, for all the criticism that a lot of the other veterans who aren't performing get, it seems Yankos eludes a lot of that criticism. I get that he is a lot more popular. You know, he's a fun streamer, and people like him more, and he's a fun personality, and so he's just generally going to get less criticism than a player like Perks, but Yankos was also very bad last split, and that's why he falls to number 4. Wunder is absolutely nothing on the top side right now. I thought he was going to come in and be very good because he was good for Fnatic in his brief stints last year, you know, coming back in the playoffs in, you know, the season finals for Fnatic when Oscar was injured. I think he looked really good in that circumstance. Obviously, he was good in winter, maybe not perfect, but he's been one of the best top laners. I thought he would reassert his post at the beginning of this year, but it didn't really happen. He was just okay. He was an okay laner. He would win some games, lose some games, really wasn't consistent at all. Again, you're hoping that he ends up being better because it just kind of looks like an average top lane performance, which is not what you bring Wunder in for. And then, of course, the final nail, you know, the final piece of the puzzle here is Perks in the mid lane. I've been a Perks defender, a staunch Perks defender on this channel because I do think that people have very selective memory when it comes to the past for him as a player. Let's just speak about him coming back from North America, everything after Cloud9, joining Vitality. People forget that in 2022 on that Vitality team, if they don't completely bottom out in the final week of the season and miss the playoffs, he wins the MVP in 2022 summer. He was the best player in the league that split, and the only reason he didn't win the award is because that team got demolished in the final week of the season. They went 0-3 and they missed the playoffs, and so the award went to Niski, who was on a better team. That was the only reason Perkz didn't win it. We talked about it a lot at the time. I covered every single one of those games, but listen to any podcast from the time. Perkz was still the runner-up. He got second in the MVP voting, and he would have won it again. So 2022, okay, he was still good. 2023, he almost won MVP again in winter. Again, people forget this because Niski was very good and Mad Lions was good and Vitality really underperformed in winter, but he was so good. The dude was dominating every laning phase. We had never really seen consistent lane stats like what he was able to put out last winter. And even in spring, we'll talk about it, but when that team was clicking in spring, go look. Like, you can still look at the spring stats and the winter stats for mid lane. He was destroying everybody in lane. Like, the positives were still there, even if he wasn't as explosive in the back half of games. His team fighting had definitely taken a dip, but summer was a massive regression. Now, you could blame that on the fact, and what I at the time said was that he had to play with Bo, and Bo was like really in the game flipping mood at that point. The team, he actually looked really good that one week they played Dagless because he was allowed to just kind of do his own thing, and I thought him coming over here to Heretics, getting to play with Yankos, getting to play with a stable bot lane, I thought this was a perfect situation and a perfect recipe for him to reemerge as one of the better mid laners, but that was the worst split he's ever played. I think that's clear to me, is I don't think he's ever been as bad as he was in winter here. All of the regression signs really came to a head in winter, and you just have to hope that that's not going to continue. Obviously, the track record, I think, is better than people think it is, but, you know, it's not been perfect in the last two splits, and that's really the most important ones at the current moment, is what you've been doing recently. He's going to come in as my number 8 mid laner. I still think he's better than, you know, like Jackie's and, you know, Seiken. These players that really struggle just because of the longevity of, you know, how good he's been in the past, but he's got a lot to prove this split, and if he's really bad, Heretics is not going to live up to the potential of being a Worlds team that I think they desperately thought that they were going to be. People had them, me included, in their top 2. I had them very clearly in the top 2 at the beginning of the year, and they've just not been that so far. Hopefully Flacket can take that next step with Trimby as his support. Hopefully, you know, Yankos and Wunder can get back on track, and Perkz can figure something out to be able to survive, because this team is simply too good to be down here at number 5. And then moving on now to number 4 in my power rankings. And of course, top 4 is really the important benchmark to hit. That is the best of 5 stage in the LEC, and top 4 is Worlds. And so if you can get enough championship points to get to that spot, obviously that's where you want to be. But for me, coming in at the bottom of the top 4, which I think is pretty established in my opinion, it is going to be Fnatic. I think maybe surprisingly, I don't have this team a bit higher. I definitely wrestled with number 3 and 4, kind of putting them back and forth. Top 2 feels very locked into me in terms of my expectations, but honestly, the more I look at this Fnatic team, the more I actually think that parts of winter were an overperformance rather than the norm. This is a very up and down team. They have a very clear win condition in terms of the players that ended up performing super well for them in winter, but the ancillary pieces on this team, the secondary carries on this team, are just not playing well at the current moment. Things got better as they got into the playoffs, but I need to see a lot more out of this roster as a unit before I consider them a team that even remotely is in conversation near the top of the standings, near the top 2. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Oscar Rinnan in the top lane, Razork in the jungle, Humanoid in the mid lane, Noah at AD carry, and June at support. You know, I was relatively on this team going into the year. I think I ranked them higher than, you know, around the same as a lot of other analysts at number 3 coming into the year, but I did not feel like they were on the same level as any of the teams near the top. You know, obviously I had Heretics above them. I had them above them in a tier, and I also think that G2 is just well out of reach of everybody, but Fnatic somehow was kind of both they both exceeded expectations and flatlined those expectations in the same breath. It really was a weird split for them because Razork and Humanoid, 2 players who are almost notorious for not playing their best in the regular season, for taking games off that they don't necessarily deem as important, they came out and were awesome in the regular season. Humanoid was the runner-up to the MVP, in my opinion, finished second in my MVP voting, only behind Caps, and he's going to jump all the way up to the number 2 mid laner for it. I've been saying for so long now that the only reason that Humanoid is so low in a lot of my mid lane rankings when I do this every year is because I'm just waiting for that one moment for him to actually try in the regular season, for him to actually be a focal point and be consistent, you know, year over year, game over game. It's always been a struggle because he's always so lackadaisical in the regular season, where he's dying, he's losing games for his team, and then he finally turns it on in the playoffs. He was just phenomenal throughout the entirety of winter. Hopefully that keeps up, because this version of Humanoid is one of the best players in the LEC, and having him alone is enough to make this team top 4, basically without anything else. But Razork also was very good in the regular season. These two have really struggled to connect in terms of chemistry over the first couple of years that they played together. At least in my opinion, it always felt like they wanted to do different things. Humanoid really was lackadaisical, in particular about generating early prio in the mid lane. He would take laning phases off, and sometimes he would step up without vision, etc., etc. He wouldn't necessarily be the biggest power point of the map in the regular season in the mid lane, and Razork is somebody who is very feast or famine in terms of how he plays the game. He falls into the pretty classic at this point jungle trap of really good from ahead, really bad from behind. That's kind of just the summary of a lot of LEC junglers, but I think Razork is the one who exemplifies that. When he is playing fast, when he is able to generate a lot of tempo in the early game, he can end games and destroy games like almost no other jungler in the region, and it's why he's developed such a popular fan base and why people consider him such a good jungler. But at the same time, he's also somebody who, if he does lose that pressure in the early game, if he isn't quite as good early on in games, he's really not all that consistent of a team fighter, which leads to situations where he is relatively bad for his team, specifically in mid-game skirmishes. We really didn't run into that a lot over winter because he was so good in the early game and Humanoid was getting a lot of leads as well, but we saw it a bit in the Mad Lions series where he just wasn't as effective when he had to play from behind. That's always going to be the big problem with Razork. It's the reason I'm lower on him as a player than I think your average Reddit analyst would be, but he's still going to come in at number 3 for me. Again, Yankos fell down to number 4. Razork takes that spot. Razork was clearly better than Yankos in the winter, and I would expect that to continue here. But it's the rest of this team that is more questionable. Everybody we've talked about is honestly pretty accounted for, but Noah's probably your next best player here, and he was really bad for half of this split. The regular season, he inherited the Humanoid bug, where he was really bad in the regular season. You got to the best of 3 stage, and he started to play a lot better. It's always been more of a confidence thing with Noah. We know the mechanics are there. We know his ability to play within the structure of a team is really good. He's a really good primary carry if you want to dump resources into him, but he really struggled in the isolated 2v2 last split. A lot of that, in my opinion, has to do with June, who's just not a very good laner, which we will get into. I'm really glad to have been right about that. He did not have a very good winter split, but Noah, I think, also really needed to step up. He was not a great team fighter in the back half of games, even when he was given resources. He just simply needs to do more with the opportunities he was given. The positive is that he did get better as the split progressed, which is why he's at number 5 for me. This still is a drop from where I thought he was going to be at the beginning of this split, but I think he's a solid 80 carry again. And 1 to 9, it's all the same. Really, having Noah versus having basically anybody else really doesn't change all that much in terms of Fnatic. It's the other 2 players that I'm concerned about. We'll start with June. You know, I was very low on him coming into the year as somebody who covers the LCK every single week on this channel. I got to watch a lot of June last year on the Kwangdong Freaks, and he was miserable. Truly one of the worst players in all of the LCK. I was really surprised when Fnatic gave him a shot, and while he wasn't awful, like, he wasn't a horrible player, I didn't really expect him to come in and be disastrous. There's a giant gap in between the LCK and the LEC, and so him coming in and being, like, solid is pretty much what I expected, and he was basically what I expected. He was not great. He really was not good, even. He was below average, but he wasn't, like, super below average. There were supports who played worse than him. He wasn't Targamas for this team. I just don't really ever expect him to be anything other than an average to below average support. He's really bad in lane. He's a little bit better once you get out of that stage. Typically with June, what he was kind of known for when he was coming up through the Challengers League on DRX was his Enchanter play, but that has almost all fallen off. He's gotten significantly more comfortable on Engagers, and that seems to be the style that this team wants to move forward with him on. I just don't think June's ever going to be pushing this team forward, and he does hold them back, in my opinion, because he makes Noah worse in the isolated 2v2. And then you've got Oscarinin on the top side. He was really bad in the winter split. A major regression coming in from Oscar, who felt like he was on a very good trajectory after getting better basically every single split. Last year was put in spring and was a disaster, but got another opportunity in summer and obviously was way, way better. You know, grew a lot, was pretty good at Worlds. He felt like he was going to come in and kind of put it together this year. Maybe not be like a top 2 or 3 top laner, but certainly be a top half top laner, somebody who could survive. But honestly, out of Cassante, like off of Cassante, he was maybe the worst top laner not named Cabochard in the entire league, and that is very scary to say. This guy was losing every lane matchup, was not particularly useful in team fights, again, unless he was on Cassante, and even then he wasn't winning lane on Cassante. It's just very weird. Like, take away that champion from Oscar, and I'm honestly concerned about whether or not he can actually survive on the top side of this map. Maybe he does have that steady improvement like he did, the same arc, the same trajectory that he had last year where, bad first split gets better over the course of the year. That's kind of what you're hoping for if you're a Fnatic fan, but man, the start of the year has not been good for him, and that's a concern for Fnatic. Great mid-jungle duo, especially if they're on, but you have to question whether or not they're going to continue to be as proactive because it's not something that has really been all that consistent for these players in the regular season, and then it's not like the other pieces around this team are enough if Razork and Humanoid aren't playing at a super high level, at an MVP level for both. There are real concerns with Fnatic, which is why they only come in at number 4, but they have such a clear talent advantage over anybody we've talked about so far. Razork and Humanoid alone clear everybody from number 5 to number 10, and so as long as you're getting good performances out of your veteran players that you've built around here, it should be fine for Fnatic. And now moving on to number 3 in my power rankings, and this one I was honestly so surprised was so high in my power rankings. If you guys don't know, I have a little bit of an algorithm that I put these players and these teams into to kind of give myself a little bit of a guideline. I tweak the algorithm here or there, or I tweak the results here or there to kind of, make sure that I'm still in control of the power rankings, but I was very surprised to see this team grade out so high, coming in at number 3. It's Mad Lions Koi, and obviously this team just made the finals. I shouldn't be super surprised to say that they're top 3, but what I was saying towards the end of that finals was that was a great run, but I wouldn't necessarily expect that to happen again. I think a lot of things ended up going right for them, one of which is obviously BDS's benching, but Fnatic I think underperformed in their series. I think they honestly just kind of got a bit more lucky. That's not to say they didn't deserve it or that, that luck is a bad thing. Luck matters in every traditional sport as well. Like, that's just how it is. But I don't think they had the hardest road in the world, and so I didn't know if it was entirely replicable for them to do it again. But honestly, like, this team is very balanced across the board, and that gives you a lot of confidence that this actually is going to potentially be a team that's better than anticipated. So let's go ahead and talk about it. It's Merwin in the top lane, Elyoya in the jungle, Frescoe in the mid lane, Supa at AD carry, and Alvaro at support. The reason that I'm so high on this team is because I truly do think that Elyoya, Supa, Alvaro are all stars in the LEC already. Supa, in my opinion, was the best AD carry in the regular season for the LEC in the winter split. You're really excited to hear that, but we've seen this story before. In fact, last winter, I said the same exact thing about Exakick over on SK, and we just did a whole section of why he really hasn't transcended that. In fact, that was probably the best split he has played in the LEC. It's never really gotten better from there. You're hoping that's not the case for Supa and Alvaro, but honestly, the prospect pedigree of Supa and Alvaro is better than it was for Exakick and DOS, and so I have a lot of faith that this is just going to be one of the better bot lanes in the LEC basically all year long. Both of them really broke out in my opinion. Supa, I think, is a phenomenal carry. Maybe not someone who generates his own leads at a rate that you would consider elite, which is why he's not number 1 on this list. If he was going out there and dominating lane on his own and being able to skirmish really heavily in the mid game and transition those leads into ending games very quickly from the bot lane role, he would have been number 1 basically immediately because that is the best AD carry if you can do that. But he is a little bit more of a player who likes to play within structure, not necessarily the most aggressive ADC, but he is willing to step up and like win fights for his team if he does have the gold to contest doing that. He's a good player. I just want to see him unlock kind of a game breaker mentality a bit more, and he really has helped out a lot by the fact that Alvaro is also very good in the support position. He's going to move up to number 4, one of the best supports in the region, and to pair these two together, and obviously they have a lot of synergy coming up from Movistar together, it's just great. Both of them are very good at their jobs. They're both very good in their roles, and they proved that. They were able to outplay a lot of the best bot lanes going into, the ending of the finals. They weren't perfect in the playoffs. I would actually argue they were maybe a little bit better in the regular season, but they were still pretty darn good. If they were the weak link of the team in the playoffs, and Supa was first team all-pro for me in terms of the bot laners, that's pretty darn good. I think that's a really big positive. Obviously, having Elyoya on this team is phenomenal. It's really sad he goes down to number 2, but he was amazing this split. He did nothing but, reiterate everything I said in my winter primer. I did get some pushback putting Elyoya as my number 1 jungler heading into the year, but I think the only thing he did was prove that he is one of the best junglers that Europe has ever seen. Multiple time champion. He's now made the finals with multiple different iterations of this Mad Lions roster, and The only reason he's moving down to number 2 is because number 1 is undeniable, in my opinion, and there was just a player that played a little bit better than him. We'll get to him later, but Elyoya is awesome, and he absolutely is one of the best players in the LEC. Having a jungler who can take over in the early game in the way that he can, while also being super stable on facilitators and a great team fighter, it's very difficult to deal with, especially when you have a very good bot lane at playing within structure, and then 2 really aggressive solo lanes, and that's really where a lot of the optimism of this team comes in. Merwin was very fun to watch and was kind of a breakout star in the playoffs. I do want to caution some people on overhyping him just a tad bit. First of all, he was another example, kind of similar to Irrelevant, of a player who was really good with good matchups and not so good with bad matchups. That's what's going to happen when you play the eclectic champion pool that Merwin does. When you play Varus, when you play Twisted Fate regularly, like, you're going to be a bit more susceptible to counter picks if they do end up happening to you, and he was beaten a couple of times in the regular season pretty bad, where he was just irrelevant in the game. But when he was able to get those good matchups, he's crazy and wild enough as an aggressive top laner to actually be able to compete with the best top laners basically no matter what. So Merwin, a bit of a breakout star, only going to move up to 6, because can I genuinely tell you that he's definitely better than Wunder right now? I don't know that yet. Maybe one more split, right? I just need to see a bit more, because he wasn't this crazy prospect like Supa and Alvaro, where in my opinion, he was just a good prospect, and he really broke out in the playoffs. Hopefully he can keep that momentum up. And then Frescoe, talk about the player I think I was the most surprised by in a positive way. I'm really sad I only put him up to number 7 in my player rankings, but I mean, Nuke is right above him, spoiler alert. Like, it's hard to rise in the mid lane right now. He's above Perks, and that's a crazy thing that I did not think I was going to be saying at the beginning of the year, but Frescoe is very, very good. He was also super consistent throughout the year. Maybe he didn't have the highest of highs, although some of his games were awesome, but definitely didn't really have the lows of a lot of the other mid laners. I would expect him to continue to rise these mid lane rankings as the year goes on and as we get more tape of him, and kind of the brackets of players end up evening out a bit more. But this team is just very balanced. Like I said, they can win through basically any lane. All 3 of their lanes are winners, and Elyoya is kind of the glue that keeps them all together, and it's very difficult to end up dealing with that when you have teams that have weaknesses like Fnatic and Heretics and SK and Vitality, these teams that are kind of around them in terms of skill level. Matt doesn't have the weaknesses that they have. They are very, very complete, and honestly, the expectation is that they're only going to get better. Hopefully they're able to build upon the crazy run that they went on in the winter split to maybe go on another one again here in spring. And now moving on to my top 2 teams in my pre-split spring power rankings here. Excited to get into this. To me, these are clearly the 2 best teams on paper in the league, as much as I love Mad and Fnatic, and I do think they round out the top 4 very nicely. Coming in at number 2 for me, it is going to be Team BDS, and some might wonder why I have BDS so high here when they weren't able to get past Mad in the playoffs, but I think the answer is relatively obvious. If Adam was in the lineup for that series, I simply just do not believe that Mad wins it. It was already very close with GIANTX in there, and credit to GIANTX, he played pretty well in that series, but Adam is a game breaker, and he has proven it over and over again that he is the guy when he is in the game. Now, there are going to be real questions because of the nature of Adam's benching right before the semifinals, that it was reportedly, bad conduct in the team and arguments with the coach, and, it was reported on that there were arguments with other players and that the other teammates wanted him benched, but then it was refuted by Adam, who said it was only an argument with the coach and that he takes full responsibility and that, he's going into therapy and working on his anger management stuff. All of this to say, if this team is working, they are the second best team in the league. I don't know if that's going to be the case. If Adam isn't, playing for this team, that completely changes the outlook. They probably move down to number, 3 or 4. Like Mad Lions probably almost certainly jumps up to number 2 here. But, I'm going to do this as if Adam is the starting top laner, which is what I assume it is. So let's talk about the lineup as a whole. It's Adam in the top lane, Sheo in the jungle, Nuke in the mid lane, Ice at AD carry, and Lebrav at support. A lot of risers in terms of these players, but of course, we got to talk about Adam first and foremost. I think at this point it is clear to me that he is the number 1 top laner in the LEC. I know I've gotten pushback on this take before, but all this guy does is take over games in ways that other top laners aren't able to do as consistently, and I get it. The Gods champion pool, that's what's going to be associated with his name. Oh, we can only play these champions. First of all, if you have 5 champions that you can play at a super high level and aren't able to be banned out of, Okay, I'm sorry, that's too big of a champion pool. You can't ban out all 5 champions in the first rotation. He's gonna be able to get something he can play on, but it's not like he's bad on the meta picks. We saw him on Cassante a lot over the course of this split, and he was dominating games. Okay, well, everybody dominates on Cassante, but he's been really good on a lot of the bruisers that are more common right now as well. Maybe if Renekton ever comes back into the meta, people will stop talking about how he can't play a lot of other champions. He is more versatile than he gets credit for. He just has a very distinct playstyle, but that playstyle is essentially unstoppable so long as he's able to get in good positions in, draft. And I think BDS has done a phenomenal job to get him that. So long as he is in the lineup and available to me, he is very clearly the most dynamic and most important top laner to a team in the league. The other positives for me, the big positives, are the bot lane here. Labrav had a breakout split. He's been a player that has obviously, I don't want to call him a channel darling because I don't know if that's necessarily fair, but I was really hyping him up a lot back in like 2019, 2020 on this channel when he was on Vitality as a rookie, when he was doing really well. And, when he was kind of carrying that really bad team to a couple of wins, fast forward, he kind of fails on the Vitality super team because everything's going wrong. So he comes over here to BDS and he was really good last year. Maybe not a star, but very, very good. One of the top 3 supports in the region, and last split, he was amazing. Winter was almost like a re-breakout for him, an MVP candidate, in my opinion, in terms of where he was able to perform. If Labrav is going to follow up those performances, on things like Blitzcrank that are more playmaking tools, that's going to be massive for BDS, and honestly, that's going to put them at number 2 basically by itself, because he was a game breaker last split, and Ice was really good as well. He's going to move all the way up to my number 2 AD carry. I was very lenient on, where I was going to keep Ice down. I had him at number 10 in my preseason power rankings because he wasn't very good in the LCK, but also because there just weren't a lot of differences between the AD carries, and he was one of the few players that hadn't played well at a top level, and so I just threw that there. But he was mega consistent for this team. He, again, wasn't a game breaker, wasn't somebody who was given a ton of resources and asked to carry. He was just a really stable, really solid bot laner that got to play off of a playmaking support and a dominating top side, and he did his job at a super high level. You could argue he was the most consistent bot laner in the entire region last split, and so 2 seems relatively fair, but again, 1 to 9, I have to reiterate, 1 to 9. Sheo and Nuke are also good. I think Nuke in particular had a lot of good moments up until the playoffs where he was just absolutely blown back in basically every major series that they had. He got obliterated by G2 and Caps. It was really, really sad to see, and then you had the series against Mad Lions where he was also kind of a letdown. Fresco, he was definitely the better mid in that series. You have to hope Nuke is going to be able to step it up when it matters the most, but regular season was still very good for him, so I want to leave him somewhere in the middle. I did move him up to number 5, and if there is a real concern about this team in terms of what they offered last split, it was Sheo in the jungle, who was just kind of okay, really wasn't a top tier jungler, was probably a below half jungler in terms of the individual performances he was putting out, just not a very good early game pather. It was really something he improved a lot on, going from the ERLs to the LEC last year, and it seems like he has started to regress back to kind of what he was in the ERLs, and that's a bit of a concern, but if he can find the form that he had in 2023, I'm not going to be super concerned. It was just something that I noticed in the winter split with Sheo kind of underperforming some of the things he used to do at a pretty solid level. And so as long as Sheo and Nuke are fine, I think Adam is the best top laner in the region. Even if you don't think he's the best, he's without a doubt top 2 or 3, right? There's just no argument that he is not better than a majority of the top laners and that he adds more wins to your team than basically any other top laner in the region. Labrav is a star, an MVP candidate last split. Ice was super consistent, and Nuke is going to get you wins in the regular season. This BDS team is, again, very complete, but I think they have the star power to really kind of top out a lot of those charts. I would expect BDS to be a finals team, but as we've all kind of known going into this split, there really is only one number 1. And that's a good segue to bring us into that number 1 team. There really was only one option here. I don't think anybody's going to argue this even remotely. It's G2 Esports coming in at number 1. Maybe they take the split off. Maybe all of these players just kind of chill for a bit. That's kind of what they did in spring of last year after they won winter. There's really not a whole big reason for them to actually go out and win spring. They don't get anything from it other than bragging rights, other than being the best team in Europe. There's literally nothing else. They've already qualified for MSI. They've already qualified for the mid-season or the season finale, I guess. There's really nothing to play for when it comes to the spring split for them, but still on paper and in action, they are the best team in the LEC, and it's not close. Their grades should reflect that pretty clearly. This lineup is looking like Broken Blade in the top lane, Yike in the jungle, Caps in the mid lane, Hansama at AD carry, and Mickey X at support. all number ones with the exception of Broken Blade. Adam jumped him, in my opinion, for that number one spot. But if you want to say Broken Blade's a bit more consistent, I think I could believe that take. I just don't necessarily agree with it. I think Adam will add more wins to your team, but Broken Blade's perfect for what this team does, and everybody else is number one. Let's talk about the standouts, the stars from last split, Yike and Caps. I mean, maybe the single two best players in the league last split. I mean, it truly was that good coming in from this jungle mid duo. Both of them were that game-breaking type that I talk about, where you give them resources and the game becomes basically impossible for the enemy to win because they are just going to outplay the enemy in every single game. Yike and Caps both were able to do that. Caps was the very clear MVP, and he is back in like peak Caps form. Really started to kind of be on the downturn. I would say 2021, 2022, and 2023 were all kind of a downward trajectory. The graph would show, 2021 and then a little lower in 22 and then a little lower in 23. But 24 is like, oh, we're going back up. He was dominating in the winter split. He was even trying a lot of the crazy stuff that he was trying in previous splits that kind of got him caught out in the regular season. But he was getting away with it and he was making it work because he is that much better than everybody that he's playing with. He is the best player in the region and it's not close. But Yike is also pretty high up there. He is going to move into that number one jungle spot for me over Elyoya. I just don't think there's much to argue anymore. His playstyle is so complete. He was a player that coming into the league, the concern was that he was never going to be a great facilitator, that he was never going to be a great tank player, that he kind of needed to be on carries, and that is gone. I mean, the dude is the best tank player in the LEC at this point. It truly is remarkable. He's great on initiators. He's great on carries. He's the best carry jungler in the region, and it's not close. He's the best carry jungler this region has had in a while. He really is that good. And him and Caps have, I don't want to say perfect synergy, but this is about as perfect synergy as you can get. These two play off of each other at a super high level, so I'm not worried about them. They're both the best in the region. Now, number one for Hansama and Mickey X is definitely a bit more questionable because of how not good they were in the regular season. Not that they were atrocious, just that they were more of an average bot lane in the regular season than, Alvaro and Supa or Ice and Labrav. Those bot lanes were probably better than Hans and Mickey in the regular season, but when the playoffs came around, when best of five showed up, all of a sudden these two started to destroy again, and I expect that to be the case once again. Mickey's a really good player. Hans, if AD carry was a better position, he would not be at number one, but AD carry is not a particularly strong top-end position. Again, 1 to 9. You want Hansama at 6? I honestly can kind of agree with that. He's throwing a lot of the late game leads that he's able to generate in lane, but for now, these two come in as both number one in their positions. I need to see someone dethrone them, officially dethrone them, prove that they are better than these two before I knock them down from number one. And then Broken Blade, the one player who unfortunately is going to lose that number one status. Again, I just think Adam's a little bit better, but Broken Blade is such a complete player. What didn't really have a great split, but again, was great in the finals. I think he got broadcast finals MVP. I give it to Yike because Yike was terrific in the finals, but Broken Blade really steps up when it matters the most. A player I complained about for a long time being way too resource heavy, not very good on weak side. He needs a lot of assistance and resources. And, for a long time, I was right. For a long time, it just wasn't working out on TSM, on Schalke. It was never really coming together to form a complete package. But G2 just fixes players, and he's really adapted his game. I've said it in, depth on this channel in previous years. He's very good on weak side now, very good on tanks, is very good at just kind of being there for team fights when he needs to be, being whatever this team asks him to be. Still can be a strong side carry, just isn't as consistent on that as someone like Adam is at the current moment. Maybe even as someone like Photon or Irrelevant. They're probably better strong side carries. Hell, even Merwin, I think, obviously has some really interesting strong side carry, stuff. But Broken Blade is so good on weak side that he is just going to be more useful than a lot of the other players that are around him here. He is an amazing player, and he rounds out G2 very well. This is a dominant team. They are clearly the best team in the LEC. That was never in doubt at any point in the winter split, and I doubt that it will be for the rest of this year either. Even if they go 4th place and get knocked out randomly like they did last split, they're going to go on to MSI and do well. They're going to go on and win the season finals. This is the best team in Europe, and if anything changes on that front, that would be the biggest upset of the season. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC Spring Split 2024 Primer and Power Rankings video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. We went from 10 to 1. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. Of course, I do want to reiterate, if you did enjoy this video, it would really mean a lot to me if you hit that like button. There's always going to be a bit more conversation and discourse, I would say, on opinion videos that are more centered around like this one is, and so I would really appreciate if you found yourself enjoying it to hit that like like button. But of course, again, let me know in the comment section what you agree with and what you don't agree with. I don't imagine we're going to have the same power rankings, and I did stay relatively true to the standings. And so if you think that there's going to be some major changes, you're probably right. I just don't know which ones they're going to be. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Of course, you can also hit that subscribe button. We don't only post about the LEC on here. We post about all 4 of the major regions, the LCS, LEC, LCK, and the LPL every single week, as well as the NACL, Tier 2 over in North America. And so if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports on a week-to-week basis, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.